Hello everyone, Rob Earthoff here. I get a question a lot about should we celebrate Christmas as Adventists? And so I actually put together a guide. Normally, as you probably know, I create a lot of PowerPoints. In this instance, I've been starting to put things into website form. And so the answer can be found on adventlife.com. Click on guide and then click on should we celebrate Christmas? And this can be a very emotional topic because when we understand, we grew up in Egypt, right? We've grown up in Babylon, and there are a lot of things that are attached to our childhood, that sense of nostalgia, that sense of just a desire for purer times, when maybe we were around family and we felt, really, really good. Maybe even today, it's a time of the year where we're able to come together with family. The world kind of has taken the period of the time off, so it's just a nice time of the year, right? The question though is what's the real answer? And so I kind of walk through that in this guide. I think the big part is, what, ultimately should, demand our attention in terms of Christmas. And so I think the first thing I get into is just this idea of what is Christmas to you? So if, we all are going to have a different lens in terms of what we do with it, how we embrace it, and also how we even potentially couch this or phrase this to our children. And so I think it's important to get a sense on, what is the focus, right? Is the focus on the nativity, right? Is the focus on, bringing in the good news, the gospel, right? The good news, the gospel message that Jesus came to free us? Or is the focus on a, presents and a fat man who comes down your chimney and, with materialistic items, right? The question is, what are you treating Christmas like? Because if you're utilizing it just as a time to remember Christ, right, then, that has a very different, outcome than if you are utilizing it as an opportunity to further embed in the world. I do want to point out that the date itself, is interesting. Let's kind of dive into when this date was. So usually we expect the 25th of December to be when Christ, was born, right? That's what we would understand. But if we actually look into it, right, one, we're not given a time because God didn't want us worshiping Christ's birth, right? The second thing would be that if we were to look into it, though, the whole idea was that God did not want there to be idolatry, and so we find that in Ellen White's writings here, you can look. If you go to the site, you can actually grab this code and put it into the search engine, and it'll pull up the exact quotes. All this right here is actually just text. And so Ellen White tells us that he concealed, this time that the day should not receive honor that should be given to Christ, because we have this mentality of where we want to honor things, but we honor the object versus the individual. If we were to look into when was Christ likely born, well, we find that the Jews under Roman rule, right, they had to keep coming back for consensus every year, and so if they were to travel to do this very unpopular task of census, then they're not going to want to do it in the winter because it's going to be really hard to travel. And so, when we read in Luke that, this decree, which is what brought Jesus into Bethlehem, of this taxation, they wouldn't have done it in the winter. They would have done it in a time period where the roads were still okay. The second piece is that the shepherds, right, they're out there in the middle of the night, and they're probably not going to be keeping their flocks at night in the wintertime, as they would be looking for more of a shelter. The other piece is if we can do ultimately some calculations, right, if we look at the clues, researching the timing of John the Baptist's birth and the Feast of the Tabernacles, we'll understand that it's December is highly unlikely. Okay, so ultimately then, what is this date? Where does this date come from, right? History teaches us that the 25th of December was a date that the Roman emperor established the religion of the unconquered sun as the official religion alongside the Roman cults. And so this idea of Sol Invictus will start coming up, right? Sol being sun. And so if we look into this, we find out that, here's a quote here, that Constantine decreed that, Dies Solis, or the day of the sun, or Sunday, as a Roman day of rest to replace the Jewish Christian Sabbath. So that's interesting, okay? So this becomes the date that the Sabbath was changed. We also see, one day of the week was named after the sun, right? And we see how ultimately the first church was, closing this law, right? The first Sunday closing law, right, was actually by Constantine. And so, again, we start seeing this concept of Day of the Sun and legislation for a Sunday law. And that's kind of what December 25th is celebrating, is essentially celebrating the Sunday law. But let's kind of get into that. So the unconquered sun was ultimately what we find here. Let's just read here from the History of Christmas. And this is from the History Channel. In addition to members of the upper class, often celebrated the birthday of Mithra, the god of the unconquerable sun, on December 25th. It was believed that Mithra, an infant god, was born of a rock. For Romans, Mithra's birthday was the most sacred holy day of the year. So the most sacred holy day of the year for pagan Rome was the birth of Mithra on December 25th. But we'll understand that Mithra is actually just a localized name. And so we can actually look into this, and we see that, yes, for Romans, Mithra, and by the way, this is actually, if you look into the depictions of Mithra, it's actually what we understand as our Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty that's, the statue that's both in France and then also in the United States is actually a statue to Mithra. Anyway, Lady Liberty is essentially Mithra. But anyways, that's not the point now. Krishna also, he rises on December 25th. So the Indian localization of Christmas would be Krishna, right? December 25th also is Attis. Now, if you'll notice, the hat that Attis wears is actually what our stocking hat looks like. The hat that Santa wears is actually the hat that Attis wears. We can also know that Horus was born on December 25th. Now, as we start kind of moving into this, it gives us a clue. So Horus coming from Egypt. Now, if we're familiar with our history, we'll know that there was a time period where the grandson ultimately the grandson of Noah, right, the grandson of Ham, who rebelled, he started to form a lot of cities, right? This was Nimrod. And when Nimrod died, I'll get into it, but ultimately Semiramis, his wife, didn't want to give up the rule. And so she invented a story that said that Nimrod died, became the sun, and then impregnated her with the rays, and then she had a child named Tammuz. Now, what we understand is that ultimately she just got pregnant by, a servant, potentially, whoever it would be, and then said this was from Nimrod after he died. So Nimrod, as we understand again, right, in Genesis 8, Cush began Nimrod, right, and began be a mighty one on the earth, right? He is the one that founded Babel and many other cities. Again, we see that in multiple places that he was this mighty warrior. This rebellion that he brought forth was based on a distrust of God, and so when he made the Tower of Babel, that was because he didn't trust God. And it says here in Micah that we shall lay waste the Syria, the sword, and the land of Nimrod, right? So the Assyrians came from the land of Nimrod. Also, interestingly enough, if we get into I'll get into that in a second here, but ultimately, if we get into the history of it, is that his wife Semiramis was the only queen of this. Was the only time there was a female king of the army. So of the Assyrian army. So here again, we see this link between Nimrod and Assyria. The book of Two Babylons by Hislop links Nimrod with Ninus, right? And so that's where we're getting this link again. All these kind of these individuals linking together, and we'll see here that he was known as Ninus and Ra, Zeus, based on which country, which localized dialect, he had a different name. But ultimately, it was the same person. It was elder worship. Ultimately, they looked to their elders and said, "Oh wow, he found the city. How amazing was he?" And they would kind of put that through. So we can also start looking up, who was Semiramis, and we find that after Nimrod died, right, Semiramis succeeded Ninus, who was his spouse, and she held the land which now the Sultan rules. Now, this is a little bit unclear in terms of the lineage of how this all played out. But what we actually do see is that Semiramis ultimately ran campaigns in Egypt, of course, Egypt, in India, right, in the region that is now India, and that is how that lore moved into Hinduism. What we also identify is that this is where the obelisks come from. So the obelisk is we see here, these are all obelisks, right? What we have in front of the Capitol is the same exact thing that we have in front of the Vatican. It's in Egypt, right? It's in, Germany and France and Turkey, all over the world, we have this obelisk. And if we get into it, and I have a course, if you haven't watched it already, called Public Secrets, really interesting course where we look at all these symbols that are, right in our face that actually have pagan symbolism. So this obelisk here, which represents sun worship, ultimately was kind of a phallic symbol representing, well, I'll just leave the word phallic there. So this was the foundation of the mystery religion, was the foundation of all this. And we see how Semiramis, who in this space is the mother, right? It's the false trinity. Anytime that there is a female deity in the trinity, then it's a false trinity. And so Semiramis being the mother, Nimrod the father, and Tammuz being the son. This is the pagan godhead, so to speak. And we read here, and they forsook the Lord and served Baal, who's Nimrod, and Ashtaroth, who is Semiramis. Now, their son Tammuz we find later, and let's get into that. Oh, but also here, other names for Queen Semiramis: Aphrodite's, Ishtar, Ashtoreth, Kali, right? You can see the whole list there, right? And so so Semiramis had Tammuz, and Tammuz was ultimately killed by a wild boar. And this is why when it says in the Bible that they're weeping for Tammuz, they were weeping for, and they worshipped towards the east. It's sun worship. They're worshiping, Tammuz. And Tammuz was the one, ultimately we'll find out, that is associated with the December 25th birthday. And so this is who they were weeping for, right? So again, other names here, Attis, we just saw that one, Tammuz, Dionysus, Hercules, right? All of these are all the same name for Tammuz. And now this is ultimately also linked to a particular time of the year, the time of the year that has the least amount of light, right? Where the sun is, in the sky the shortest amount of time. It's pretty interesting that his birthday coincides with the least amount of light in the sky, right? And that's that kind of idea that it's, it's now marked more as a few days earlier, but this was celebrated. We see this here. And Plutarch in 65 says, on the winter solstice, the sun would seem to be a little child, right? And it says here that the day is the shortest, and the god is accordingly shown as a tiny infant. So this is where the idea of the infant comes from, right? So Tammuz, being this infant, right? And we start seeing how it brings these interesting, things with it. So when we look at the idea of the positioning of the sun at a certain time, it will shine perfectly through these different pillars. And that's where we get things about, Stonehenge and everything else. There was a study in Germany that collected essentially this information around Woodhenge, which is like similar to Stonehenge, and it says they found cut up bodies of children, of women, and all of the orientation of their Woodhenge in Germany aligned with this the sun on that particular day. So there's a different one in Denmark. They have Odin, Thor and Frey, right? And that cult demanded human sacrifices. So there's a direct link between this specific day of winter solstice and human sacrifice. So we know that it's pagan. In Rome, they honored Saturn, right? The feast of Saturnalia, which is what they replaced Sabbath with. So Saturday, Saturnalia, Saturn. They replaced the Sabbath with that name. So here we go, Saturnalia. It's the festival in Rome aligned with the winter solstice, honoring the Roman god Saturn. And so we see here, the holiday was celebrated as a sacrifice in the temple of Saturn with a banquet, right? They get gift giving and partying. So their signature event of Saturnalia was feasting and gluttony. So again, as we start thinking about, how do we celebrate Christmas? Is it celebrated through feasting, through gluttony, having parties, or is it focused on using it as an excuse to look at Christ? We read here in the Spirit of Prophecy tells us that the day is generally spent in feasting and gluttony, with a needless amount of money spent in self-indulgence, right? The appetite and the sensual pleasures are indulged and at the expense of the physical, mental, and moral powers. This is displeasing to God, and souls have been lost by this means. We read here, so the question becomes, should we participate in this or not? Ellen White makes it clear. We advise all our brothers and sisters to make a decided reformation, means to reform, right? Make a reformation in regard to these festal days. This is an article about Christmas that was in the Review and Herald. She says, it's our privilege to depart from the customs and practices of this degenerate age. So she's saying right here, it is our privilege to distance ourselves from this. Now she says more, I'm going to get into that as well. But this is just the first piece is, we are advised to move from it. But she does also have quotes on trees. On Christmas, so soon to come, let not the parents take a position that an average evergreen placed in church for the amusement of Sabbath scholars is a sin, for it may be a great blessing. Keep before their minds benevolent objects. In no case should mere amusement be the object of these gatherings. So what she's saying is that if you want to have a Christmas tree, even in the church, that there's nothing wrong with that if the focus is in the right place. She says, shall we have a Christmas tree? Will it not be like the world? You can make it like the world if you have a disposition to do so, or make it unlike the world as much as possible. Right? So when we have the tree, what is the tree for us? The tree is for us to get to presents, right? But she says here that there is no particular sin in selecting an evergreen and placing it in our churches, but in the sin lies the motive which prompts the actions, which is made of the gifts placed upon the tree. So why are we looking at using this as an opportunity to help the poor, or are we looking at it as an opportunity to serve self? In every church, however small, special effort should be made to show our gratitude to God by bringing our offerings for this cause. Let those who desire a Christmas tree make its boughs fruitful with gifts for the needy and offerings for the treasury of God. And let the children learn the blessedness of giving. So if this becomes an event all about, not incorporating in, all of the pagan items, but if you want to have just an evergreen tree and you want to use it as a place where people donate, she says, go for it, is what she says. But we must understand that there is a tie of this idea of carving and decorating trees. Okay, so even though Ellen White does not take a firm stance against it, in terms of the trees, we should also understand, though, that there was some text that says, thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of the heathen. For the customs of people are in vain, for one cutteth a tree out of the forest, right? And then they deck it with silver and with gold, and with hammers that it move not. So they fix a tree inside, and they decorate with silver and gold. Okay. Historically, right, in 16th century Germany, this was called a paradise tree, and it represented the tree of knowledge from the Garden of Eden, which were erected in people's homes during this annual feast of Adam and Eve on December 24th. And they were decorated with apples, which represented sin, and these wafers, which represented the redemption, to commemorate the day of Adam and Eve, who were symbolically redeemed through Christ on this day. So they tried to bring it into this Christian context. We read here that evergreen trees were important fertility emblems of pre-Christian ceremonies, marking the winter solstice. Mistletoe, druids, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, the idea is that, there's no question it has a pagan context. But the question is that, how are we utilizing this? Are we utilizing this for good or not? Are we utilizing this, we're here in gift giving, right? Is it focused on us or others? If we're truly celebrating the life of Christ, we would honor, we would want to honor his way of his self-sacrifice. And we read here, the wealthy brings gifts to their friends, but they're still rich. Call upon the needy and the poor, right? So this idea that should we be giving gifts at Christmas? Well, it says here that if we celebrate it only in seeking to give pleasure to our children and one another, our offerings are diverted from the true object. So if the focus of Christmas is giving gifts to each other, then we're utilizing the wrong point of view. How stinted are the offerings on this day that go in the Lord's treasury, needless expending time and money, and the poor and needy being neglected. It would have been a great blessing to the needy, and would have carried the gospel of the light to those that sit in darkness had we just changed that focus. We read again, the desire to make gifts may be turned into pure and holy channels, but self-denial and self-sacrifice must be marked in this course of action. We also read here, what if the gift is, not costly? You say, it's not. It says here, the holiday season is fast approaching. Again, Ellen White writing in Review and Herald. And the interchange of gifts, upon their friends as a token of remembrance. It is pleasant to receive a gift, however small, from those we love. It is an assurance we're not forgotten, and it seems to bind us a little closer. So she's saying here that, if you want to give a little gift to each other, no big deal. She writes here that she says, I would not wholly condemn the practice of making Christmas and New Year's gifts to our friends. She just continues, we should make our gifts such as we prove a real benefit to the receiver. So again, this is not a full endorsement by Ellen White, but it's also not a full condemnation. That's what I think is important to understand. Ellen White never directly endorsed Christmas, but she understood the mindset of the Israelites coming out of Egypt. She understood the mindset that it would probably be an unnecessary hurdle to push this point on people who are maybe still learning about the truth and had done the research and understand the pagan origins of this. So she says here, ultimately the headline is, if you can't avoid it, make a positive out of it, right? She says, as Christmas comes around, your children have been instructed that, have been seeing, right, that, they're going to want something with this. You may find it difficult matter to pass over this period without giving it some attention. It can be made to serve a very good purpose. And so she's saying, if your kids are, seeing everybody out there and the whole world is doing Christmas, and you don't want to make them feel, you don't want to, you can't get past it. She says, well, then utilize it for good, right? Put them in a nativity scene or whatever it is. We read here, the desire for amusement, instead of being quenched and arbitrarily ruled down, should be controlled. So she's saying, instead of saying, do not celebrate Christmas, right? She's saying, avoid the direct pagan objects and use it as a time to focus and channel the mind back to Christ. The youth should be treated very carefully. They should not be left on Christmas to find their own amusement. in vanity and pleasure seeking, in amusements which will determine their spirituality. Parents can control this matter by turning the minds and offerings of their children to God and His cause, the salvation of souls. This is an opportunity for other-centeredness, right? This is an opportunity, let's make it about Jesus, right? Let's make it about others. Let's avoid unnecessarily spending money that could be used in ministering to the poor. Let's, if we are to give gifts, let's give gifts that she says are, practical and which edify, not gifts that are feeding our gluttonous ways, right? Things that bring us closer to God. And she talks all throughout this idea of remembering temperance through this time. And so again, we leave that with let your works be in accordance with your faith. For those newer believers that do not understand ultimately the pagan history of this, we should be lighter with them, right? For those that actually understand, we should make sure that we are not allowing ourselves to be pulled into the world, but instead utilizing this as an opportunity where people have a mindset that could be reached about Christ. Even if it has nothing to do with his birthday, it could be an opportunity for us to reach others about Christ. And I think that's the important part. So anyways, again, I hope this was a fairly balanced view on this, as it is a very tough topic for a lot of people that are feeling like they have a desire to not just kind of ignore it, and the focus just needs to be pointed in the right direction.